Okay, so today's assignment is called a charcoal reduction drawing, and it's where we have a solid black or a dark background, and then we're going to draw out or erase the highlights and the midtones. So that will give us our shape. So today I'm going to draw a picture of it's a black and white still life of three pears. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cover my canvas with a dark black. And so I'm going to, if I scroll down through my tools, and right below my eraser is a charcoal tool, a chalk pastel, and I'm going to set my opacity to about 60%, use the side of my pen, and I'm just going to lightly cover all my canvas. And it doesn't need to be smooth or even. We can have some areas that are darker than others, some that are lighter. I like having these white specks in here because it shows the tooth. I'm trying to mimic the paper, so I want to show some tooth and some texture. So that gives me a pretty good black background, and I can go over it multiple times. I can change my opacity. If I need lighter or darker, I can change my brush width or the tip of my pen. So now that I have a nice dark background, I'm going to switch to the eraser. I'm going to use the eraser point, and I want a fairly small tip and really light opacity because I just want to draw the outline of the pears so I know where they are. And this drawing has three pears. I'm just going to do one at a time. The nice thing about using fruit as a still life is if the pear that I'm drawing doesn't look just like the picture, nobody knows. If you were drawing a portrait, you'd have to be spot on or people would see your mistakes. But with fruit, you have a lot of freedom, a lot of leeway. So there's my shape of a pear. And so now I just want to erase out where the light is hitting the pear in the still life picture. I'm just going to slowly take away some of this, take away the black, and I'm going to have to do a lot of experimenting with pressure tip or pressure on my pen and the angle of my pen because I don't want a really sharp line. I want to just remove a little bit of the background at a time. I don't want it to be bright white yet. So I'm just erasing out. And I want this to mimic an actual drawing on paper with a charcoal stick. So I'm not going to use the smudge tool or a blending tool. I just want to mimic using charcoal and a kneaded eraser. So this pear, any shape that's round, I'm going to use the same properties that we did in creating our sphere where it's divided into 5 parts. I have a highlight, a midtone, a core shadow, a reflected light, and a cast shadow. And the nice thing about doing this on an iPad is I can blow up or I can enlarge parts of it. It's easier to work on. So I'm going to work on the stem right now. In my picture, you'll remember the stem has quite a bit of highlight showing. bottom side of it. Then one thing I'm going to do to make the stem stand out, whoops, sorry, to make the stem stand out against the background, I'm actually going to darken the background right around the stem. So I'm going to go back to my pencil, fairly small, pretty dark, and I'm just going to color in. I'm going to blend that so that it kind of fades into my background. Color that in just a little bit more. To make your lights really stand out, you put darks next to them. So now when I reduce this, when I shrink it back down, now my stem is just a little bit more visible. And I'm going to do that to the whole pear eventually. I'm probably not going to outline the entire pear, but I am going to add some darker parts to some of the background. Okay? And blend that in there so that it looks a little more seamless. All right, now I'm going to turn my attention back to the pear. And the pear has a core shadow right down the middle of it. Okay, so I'm going back to the pencil. About 9% opacity and like a medium-sized tip. And I'm just going to lightly go over this. And I'm going to have to go over it several times because I want to just gradually fill this center core shadow so that it's darker than the midtones or the halftones on each side of it. And this is given a core shadow, midtones, and highlights is what's going to make this pear appear to be three-dimensional and not just a flat surface. So take your time on this part. This you can't, if you rush this, your work will suffer. It'll show that you've not spent enough time on it. I'm going to adjust my tip width, make it just a little bit fatter. I want my edges, I don't want solid edges. I want them to be blended in so that it's a gradual between the highlights and the core shadow. I want it to be fairly seamless. And then when I shrink that down, maybe that's as far as it'll reduce. So I'm going to look at it overall and see what's missing. And I can tell right now, obviously my stem is way too bright compared to the rest of the pear. So now I'm going to go back to my eraser and I'm going to give me a little bit brighter highlights on this leading edge that's closest to the light source. I'm going to really angle my pen so I get a wider, softer feel. Maybe change the the stroke or the my pen. I'm going to try a circular, see if I can keep that edge a little bit softer. There's a little bit of highlight going on the other side of the pear. There's a little bit of ambient light in the room when they took this picture. Now the nice thing about using the iPad obviously is you can use your back button if you don't like the strokes that you just made. Use your back button. To me that was too light, so I'm gonna just even a lighter stroke than what I had. I don't want that too bright, but I still want it lighter. Not as light as the other side of the pear, but lighter than the midtones that I had. And then I can also, if I'm still too bright, I can switch back to my pencil and a really low opacity and do a really light coat or another pass over the top of it. Make sure I got the right color. Put just a little bit more gray back over there, just to knock down those highlights just a little bit, especially right there. Then, like I did on the stem, I'm also going to darken in this side of the pear because I really want this to stand out. I want it to stand out from the background so it doesn't completely fade away into it. I don't mind if I lose some of the edges into the background. Darken that just a tad, maybe soften that edge by going over it a little bit. Okay, so there's my first pear. Now, you can spend as much or as little time as you want finishing this off. So the pear, since it's not a completely smooth surface, there are some dimples and some raised areas of the pear where the light's going to catch areas that stick out a little bit, and areas that are sunk in are going to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to add just a few highlights in here, and that's going to give my pear just a little bit more texture because it's not completely smooth. Maybe I'll add just a few darks. If I have a light area again and I put darks next to it, it's going to make that light area really stand out. So these are little divots or indents in the pear that the light is not getting to, so they're a little bit darker. And I think that my stem is just a little too bright, so I'm going to go back over with just a little bit of gray, tone down that highlight some. There we go. All right, so shrink that down if I can. So there's my first pear. Now I'm going to add two more pears. It's just going to be the same process, and I will just quickly sketch in the next pear with my eraser tool. Just about as light as I can, and that's so I'm using as light of a touch as I can on the screen surface. And then this third pear overlaps the middle pear, and that gives the whole picture more dimension when we have overlapping shapes or one's in front of another. That almost looks like a thumb. So there's the basic shape of my other two pairs. And I'm just going to go along and do the exact same thing I did on, or the same process I did on the first pair. I'm going to slowly, too bright, I'm going to slowly erase out the highlight areas. And then if you'll look back at the picture that I'm working from, there's a cast shadow from this third pair, from the end pair onto the middle one. And that cast shadow, I'm going to fill that in right now so I know where it's at. And that's also going to add some three-dimension looks to our composition. So I'm going to hurry and just do a layer, just a couple of layers. I'm using the pencil. I could use the charcoal again. Either tool will work. I don't know that it really does make a whole lot of difference here. But now my cast shadow is a little more prominent. It's going to make that pair recede back in space a little bit. I'm going to go back to my eraser, knock out some more highlights. Enlarge it so I can see my stems a little better. Okay, so I've enlarged my canvas because I want to get a little more detail in this stem. I'm going to erase a few more highlights out of it. And I'll do the same thing with this stem that I did with the other one, in that I am going to put a little bit darker background around this stem so that it stands out. But remember, I want that, if I'm adding dark to the background, I want it to blend in with the background. I don't want to really see a dark pencil line. I want it to be a smooth transition. Just a little bit of correct a few lines there that I didn't like. Maybe add just a little bit more highlight right near the top. So any part of the object or the fruit that's closest to the light source is going to be brighter, have a brighter highlight. Okay, so let's shrink it back down and let's see how the overall picture's looking. So my erasing out of the body, the midtones is pretty rough. So I'm going to work on this for just a couple of minutes without any instruction, but you can just watch what I'm doing. Okay, so if you'll notice in the original picture, A cast shadow causes a pretty sharp, a pretty harsh edge, which I've got going here. And it bothers me a little bit that it's that sharp because the rest of my picture has pretty soft edges. But for it to be believable, I think we need to keep the sharp edge of it. I'm going to work on this core shadow just a little bit. I want it to be a little bit more gradual as it goes into the midtones. I've got these highlights too bright, so I'm going to knock down the value by putting just a light layer of gray. And remember, to get gray, I'm just lowering my opacity and how heavy or how light of pressure I'm using with my pen. So this is a part of our drawing where you can really spend some time getting a lot of detail work in there and getting everything just how you want it. Okay, let's shrink this down again. Let's see how our composition looks so far. So now we're going to work on our last pair, and the picture that my reference picture shows that this pair, since it's closest to the light source, has quite a bit of highlights in it. Go back down to our eraser. Right. The stem on this one has more highlights than the other two, just because of its proximity to the light. The highlights on this one are pretty bright. There's a lot of white in it. So I'm just knocking out these midtones. Midtones are halftones, same thing. Round off my bottom of my pear a little bit more. I've got kind of a funny shape right there, so I'm going to clean that up while I'm here. And these highlights go just about halfway through the pear. Now, for those of you that have used a drawing program like this, you're aware of the corners you could cut by using a white pencil or a smudge tool to get the same effect, but I want you to just use the eraser, the pencil, and the charcoal, because I want to try mimicking if we were actually doing this on paper. I want this to look as close to a physical drawing as we can. Too bright. Let me cut that down just a little bit. So remember, this last pair has the brightest highlights of the three, but maybe not quite that bright. So let's go over it with our gray just to tone it down just a little bit. Okay, then make sure that our core shadow here in the center is darkest, remember that's where the surface changes, where the plane change is, where the pear is turned away from the light's not going to bend around it. So this core shadow is our darkest part of the pear. The left side of the pear is lighter because we have reflective light. We have light hitting the table and then bouncing back up into the pear. So this one edge is going to be, on all three pears, are going to be just a little bit lighter because of the reflective shadow. And I want to get rid of the lines that I drew, that I erased out originally. I tried doing this with multiple layers and I couldn't get it to work right because I needed to be able to erase on all the layers together.
That makes sense.
Those erase lines are bugging me a little bit. Let's see if I can smooth those out. It takes several passes at it. And I'm going to add a little bit of shadow on my stem where the stem turns away from the light. And I'm still going to fill this in back here, and my stem may disappear into the background, the darks, but that's okay. If you happen to be a fan of art history, you'll notice that that's something they did in the Renaissance is darks would disappear into the background. Okay. All right, let's shrink it down. The very last thing we need to do is add the cast shadows. And the cast shadow kind of follows the shape of the pear. The cast shadow is always darkest nearest the object, and then it gets a little softer and a little lighter the farther away it gets. I'm going to have this, depending on the angle of your light, I'm going to have this cast shadow go all the way to that pear. This pear's got just a little bit of a shadow. And then our first pear, it actually is going to go off the canvas just a little bit. So remember, darkest, nearest the object, sharper lines, nearest the object, the farther away we get, a little bit softer and a little bit lighter. So I have a little bit of this highlight right here, and that is my reflective light, again, where the light hit the table, whoops, and bounced back up into the body of the pear. A little bit still too bright. I'm going to go with a pretty light touch on my pen, and this assignment is a good practice on learning control. A little bit more reflective light in this one, and I think we've already got enough reflective light on this one. So shrink it down. There's our three pears, using the charcoal reducing or reduction method. Um, with another 15 minutes or so, I think I would go along and make my darks a little bit darker, just clean up some of my edges. Maybe add a little bit more texture into the skin of the pear. But overall, I think I'm about done. All right. So yeah, so I would maybe smooth some of these lines out. You can obviously spend as much time as you've got, as much as you'd like, and the more time you spend, obviously, the better job you're gonna do. But don't don't stress about it. Do it until you're satisfied. So there's my three pairs. Thank you.